In this video, we're going to go ahead and start our MongoDB Node.js CRUD application. If you haven't watched the previous videos where we go over what we're going to be building and the tools required to build it, I suggest going back and reviewing those and making sure you got everything that you're going to need. If you already have everything you're going to need, then let's get started. I'm going to go through the coding of this application relatively quickly. I'm not going to get too deep into every little detail as we go along. I understand that there's going to be people at different skill levels going through this project. My intent is to just get through this, and so everybody has at least the same context. We're all on the same page by the time we get to the end of the video as far as what we're building and what we're going to try to understand. And then after we're done with the project and we have the working application, then we can go back and start diving a little bit deeper into some of the components of our application, some of the components of Node.js itself, and some of the components of MongoDB itself in the documentation as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so we're going to need a place for our project to live, so let's go ahead and create a new folder. Call it CRUD. Open that with our editor. Close that. Expand that. We'll need an index.js file. Index.js. And let's make it a little bigger. Alright. So we're going to need our server, and the way we're going to do that is use the HTTP module. Has a method called createServer. So we'll need to bring in the HTTP module. So const HTTP equals require HTTP. And like I said, we'll need to use that createServer method to create a server, and then we'll need to store it in a variable. So we'll call it const server equals http.createServer. And that createServer method is going to take a callback that's going to be called each time our server gets a request. So it's our request handler. Let's go ahead and define that. And it's going to give us the request object and the response object. And so when we get that request, just for now, we're going to go ahead and send a response with res.end. Hello, newbies, is what we're going to send in the response body. And then we need to have the server listen for request with the server.listen method. And that'll take a port number. Doesn't have to be 3000, it can be whatever you like to choose, but I'm just going to use 3000. And it's going to take a callback that is going to run whenever the server is spun up. So we'll say console.log, listening on port 3000. And that's all we need for our first server. So let's just go ahead and make sure that's working. Go to View, Integrated Terminal. Type in node index or .js, but you don't need to. Enter, and we get back listening on port 3000. So our server is now listening on port 3000 for any requests we make to it. And we can go ahead and check this by opening a browser. Put in localhost 3000, enter, and we get back hello newbies. And we can go ahead and inspect that response a little bit further. Go to your Dev Tools, Network, and go ahead and refresh. Click on localhost, and you'll see that here's our response headers: connection keep alive, content length 14, the date it was sent. We can even see the request headers that were sent to our server. Alright, so we know our server's working. We can go ahead and close that. Let's go ahead and stop our server. So now that we're able to receive requests and we are getting our request object being sent every time we get that request, we're going to need to get some information off of that object in order to see how we want to respond to that request. And so what we're going to do now is create an object of the parsed data that we're receiving in that request object, and then later we can respond to that data depending on the request that we receive. So let's go ahead and create const. We'll call it parsed rec equals an empty object, and then we'll just add to this. So we are going to need another dependency called URL. So the first thing that we're going to get is we're going to take the URL that we receive on that object and parse it out. And we'll do that with, we'll store it in parsed rec dot parsed URL. And that's going to come from URL dot parse rec dot parse URL, and the second argument will be true. And this true, if you're looking at the IntelliSense here, is going to give us back the parse query string. So if this was set to false, then this object right here that we'll end up having wouldn't have the parse query string on it, but it will since we set this to true. The next piece of data that we're going to extract out of the rec object is going to be the path. So we'll say parsed rec dot path equals parsed rec dot parsed URL dot path name. The next one's going to be the trimmed path. So we're going to take the path name and trim the leading and ending forward slashes to kind of normalize it so that we can always expect it not to have those in the string when we're comparing it. So we'll store that in parsed rec dot trimmed path equals parsed rec dot path dot replace, and that'll take a regular expression Now there's a few other ways that you could have done this, but this is the way that I've seen it done in a few places, and it's not that hard of a regular expression to memorize and to use. Alright, now we're going to get the method. So parsed rec.method is going to equal rec.method dot to lowercase. And we're going to make sure that that's always put to lowercase, that way that we don't have to check to see if someone capitalized any random letters in it or if they did it in all caps. We're just going to always receive it in lowercase, and that's how we should expect it. And then we can also get the headers. So parsed rec.headers equals rec dot headers and finally we're going to get that query string object that we're going to get back when we parse the URL up here. So parsed rec dot query string object equals parsed rec dot parsed URL dot query. Alright, now that we have our parsed request data, let's go ahead and make it so when there's a request sent to our server, we'll just respond with all this data and see what we get back. So instead of hello newbies, let's delete that string and we'll use backticks. So we're using a string literal template, and the first item we'll say is path, and we'll print out parsed rec dot path, and then let's see what's the next one. We'll show the trim path. So trimmed path will be parsed rec dot trimmed path. Then we'll get the method. Oops. Parsed rec dot method. We'll do the headers. So the headers is going to be an object. So headers, and we'll have to use JSON dot stringify parsed rec dot headers, and then we're going to pass null and 2. This is just some formatting for that string that we're going to get back, so it's easier to read when we get that body. So there's our headers, and then the last thing will be the query string object. We'll just say query object, and same deal, it's going to be an object, so we need to use JSON.stringify parsed request dot query string object null and 2. And in order for this just to be on the next line underneath of it, otherwise it looks kind of weird, just do a \n, which will push it to a new line, and do the same down here. New line. Hit save, and this should work. Let's go ahead and spin up our server, go back to our integrated terminal, node index, enter, and it says listening on port 3000. Open up our browser, localhost 3000, and we get our response body, and it's printed to the browser screen. So our first item was the path, and it's just the root, so just one /, and then remember our trimmed path removes leading and ending /, so it's blank because it removed it. So if I went up here and put newbies /newbies, enter, we get /newbies as the path. The trim path is just newbies. Our method is going to be get, and then our header object is printed out right here. So it's got things like keep alive for the connection, the host, the user agent, the encoding, accepted encodings, and then you'll see our query object. There's actually nothing in it. It's just an empty object, and that's because we didn't have a query string. So let's put one in there with question mark, name equals noob, enter, and you'll now see that there's a key value pair of name and noob. And so it takes whatever's after that question mark and puts it into an object for us. So we could even put another one, and you'll use ampersand. Let's say age equals 37, and you'll get age 37. So the last thing that we want to attach to this parsed request object that we made up here is going to be any body that's sent on the request object when the request is sent to our server. So we know all this already works. We can go ahead and get rid of that. And so we want to attach that body to our parsed rec object. And so once we get it, we're going to go ahead and just send that back as our response. So let's go ahead and parsed rec dot body is what we're going to send back. Now we haven't parsed that yet, so let's go ahead and do that. We're going to need a variable to store that in. We'll call that body, and that's going to equal an array, because that body is going to come into us in chunks. And so each chunk, data chunk that we get, we want to store in this variable, and then after we received all of the chunks, we're going to concatenate them together, and that's going to equal our parsed request body. So our request object is an event emitter, and it's going to emit an event each time we get a chunk. So we need to attach a listener to that data event on the request object for every time we receive data. And we do that with rec.on, our event, which is data, and our callback, and it's going to get a chunk. And each time that this event is emitted and we get a chunk, we want to push that onto the body. So we'll call body.push that chunk. So once we've received every chunk that's being sent of the body, we're going to have an end event on the request object. And we'll handle that with rec.on end, callback, no arguments, and we need to concatenate those buffer chunks together and turn it into a readable string and place it back into that body variable. We'll do that with body equals buffer dot concat, pass in body dot to string, and that toString method will default to UTF-8. Then we just need to attach our new body to our parsed request.body. That way we can pass it on to our request handler and respond. So parsed rec.body equals body, which is what we're gonna be sending with our response right here. And last thing we need to do is move that up into the request.on end event, because we can't respond with the body if we don't have it yet. So we're going to wait until this end event is emitted. We have the whole body, it's been pushed onto the parsed request object, and then we'll go ahead and send our response. So after you get this far, you can go ahead and open your terminal if it's not already. Make sure you save that. If it's not already open, if it's already, your server's already running, go ahead and Control C to shut it down. Then node index one more time to start it back up. At this point, we're going to need to go ahead and make sure that we have Postman installed on our machine. If you haven't done this yet, go ahead and backtrack a few videos, and there should be a video called Install Postman, and go ahead and get that downloaded and installed, and then come back. Once you have Postman, we're going to continue. So go ahead and open Postman. It should bring you to this page. And so just a brief explanation of Postman is we are able to make get, post, put, and delete requests with Postman and send a body. And you're not going to be able to do that with your normal web browser without using forms or actually having a website put together, because when you just type in a URL and hit enter, it's just going to do a get request. So this is going to allow us to do post requests and send a body along with that. So once you have Postman running, go ahead and make sure you've got post selected in the tab. Go to body, raw, and leave this, make sure it's at text. And our body is just going to be a simple string, hello newbies, exclamation point. And then our URL is going to be local host :3000, or whatever port number that you had chosen for your server. Hit enter, and you should get down below in the body hello newbies. So we sent a post request to localhost 3000 with a body of hello newbies, and our response, we received a status code of 200, which means our request was successful, and our response body was hello newbies. So now we know that we can go ahead and get all of the request information that we're going to need. We've got the method, the URL, the path, the request body if there was one, and so next we're going to work on our routes. So our CRUD application is going to be able to create, read, update, and delete a collection of newbies. So the route or path the user will need to use will be the newbies route. Now that we have collected all the request information, we can determine what route the user is requesting. Since we only have one route, all other routes will use a not found handler. First, we'll need an object to store our routes. So let's go just above our server declaration and create a const routes. That's going to be an object. So our route is the newbies route, so we'll name it newbies. And that's going to reference our not created yet handlers dot newbies. Let's go ahead and make a newbies handler real quick. So let's say const handlers equals an object, and let's do our newbies handlers. So handlers dot newbies equals a function, and for right now we're not going to pass any. We'll pass one argument, which is going to be the res object. We'll need that response object to be able to send our response. And so let's just simply do a res dot end hello newbies route. Let's go ahead and make a not found handler. So handlers dot not found equals a function, and it will also receive the request object or response object, sorry. And we'll do a res dot end route does not exist. We can also respond with a 404, so we can do res dot right head and do a 404. So now, based on the request that's made, we need to do the routing. And so we're going to use the trimmed path to determine the route. So if the trimmed path equals newbies, then we'll route to the newbies handler. If it's anything other than newbies, then we're going to route to not found. So let's go ahead and get rid of this right here. So let's go ahead and put the logic in place to choose the correct handler to use based on that trimmed path. We'll do that with const routed handler equals type of router parsed rec dot trimmed path not equal to undefined. So we're basically saying if this route does exist, so it's not undefined, then it will be router parsed rec dot trimmed path, or if it is undefined, will be handlers dot not found. Now that we've got the route handled, we're going to call that route. So routed handler, and we're just going to pass that response object for now. So we should get our request. We'll parse all that request information. Based on that information, we're going to set our routed handler either to newbies if they chose newbies, because then it will be defined, it won't be undefined. And then if it is undefined, then we're just going to say not found. One correction, I just realized that we named our object routes and then we're calling router down here. Let's go ahead and change that object to the router. So that should be good. And let's go ahead and test it. So go ahead and open your terminal if it isn't already open. If you already have your server running, go ahead and Control C to cancel it, and then type back in node index, enter. Make sure that it says listening on port 3000 or whatever port you chose. Go ahead and open up Postman, and we'll go to localhost 3000, hit send, and you'll see it says route does not exist because when we got here, our trimmed path was nothing. It was an empty string. And router empty string doesn't exist. And now let's try our newbies route. Type in /newbies, hit send, and we get hello newbies route. So now we're routing properly. So as I stated before, the user is going to be able to create, read, update, and delete newbies on our database. The corresponding methods our route needs to handle are get method to read from our database, post method to create an item on our database, put method to update an existing item on our database, and delete to delete an item from our database. So the first thing our newbies handler should do is determine which request method was used, then call the next appropriate handler if the method used is either get, post, put, or delete. So since we're going to need to know what the request method is, we're going to need to pass in our parsed request object to our routed handler. So let's go ahead and put that in there. Parsed rec. That'll be our first argument, and we'll pass the response object next. Let's update our handlers. So our newbies handler is gonna now take that parsed rec object, and we're not gonna need that object for the handlers dot not found, but we can just put it in there. That way it's still reading that response object as the second argument. So let's temporarily remove this line right here, the res.end. So let's create an array variable that's going to hold the 4 methods that we're going to allow. So const accepted methods equals an array. Make sure that these are all lowercase, because remember down here we're taking that request object, getting the method off of it, and putting it to lowercase. So if you do these as uppercase, or put any capital letters in there, then it's not going to work. So we'll take get, post, put, and delete. Next, we need to check if the request that we received in the method that they used is one of these, and we'll do that in an if statement down here. If accepted methods dot includes parsed rec dot method. Fix this back here. That should be if and not phi. So this array method is going to check and make sure that in this array, that method that was passed here is included in this array. If that's true, we're going to pass our parsed rec object and our response object to another handler, which is going to handle that specific request based on the method. So we'll say handlers dot underscore newbies. Make sure you put that underscore there, and pass in parsed rec dot method and then we're going to call that with the parsed rec and response object. So if the request method was not one of these four, then we need an else, and in that case we're going to just respond right head with a 400 for bad request, and respond dot end not an accepted method. Now that we're routing based on which method is being used in the request, we need to define those handlers that will be called based on the method that's used. Now we can go ahead and define our handlers for those methods. We'll attach them to our handlers object. So handlers dot underscore newbies, make sure you put that underscore in there, equals an empty object. The first handler is going to be handlers dot underscore newbies dot get equals a function. That function is going to take the parsed rec and the response object, and just for now we're going to say res dot end and the method being used. So if this handler is getting called, then they use the get method, and we'll just display that for now to make sure that it's routing properly. We'll go ahead and copy that 3 more times. Copy. And then change this one to post, the next one to put, and the last one to delete. And we'll go ahead and update these as well. And then we're going to go to Postman and see if these are routing properly. So go ahead and open your terminal, view, integrated terminal. Remember, if your server is still running, go ahead and shut it down and then spin it back up. Node index, listening on port 3000. Go ahead and bring up Postman. So the first one we'll check for the get method, local host 3000 / newbies, enter, and we get back get. So let's try post, and we get post back. Put, we get put, and delete, we should get delete, and we do. Alright, now that our routing is complete, we want to be able to make our database calls based on the method that was used. So if they made a get request, we want to get one of the newbies and send it back to them. If they made a post request, we want to take the information that they sent and create a new newbie. If they want to update or put, then we want to update a newbie. If they want to delete a newbie, then we're going to delete it from the database. So we're going to need 4 functions, just like we have the 4 functions to get, post, put, and delete. We need functions that are going to, on the database, create, read, update, and delete. So let's go ahead and make another object, const database. That's a empty object. Then below that, we're going to declare those functions. We're going to need database dot create equals a function, Let's go ahead and copy that. Three more times. So we have create, then we want read, then we want update, and the last one is delete. The first one we're going to want to work on is post, because automatically starting off fresh, we're not going to have any newbies to interact with. So we'll at least need to be able to create one. So we'll start with the post. Go ahead and get rid of this for now. And so we're going to want to call our database.create method. So let's say database.create. So database.create is going to take two arguments. The first one is going to be the newbie that we want to save to the database, and we'll just call that newbie. So when we call database.create, we're also going to be making a call to the database, which is going to be asynchronous. And so when dealing with asynchronous functions like that, we're going to have to use a callback. And this callback is going to run once that asynchronous function is completed. So our callback function for now is going to be a function that takes in an error and a result. So when we call database.create and we pass it the newbie object and the callback, it's going to go ahead and attempt to create that newbie, and if there's an error, we're going to pass back an error. If there is no error, then we're going to pass back the result. So let's pretend that we've made that call and our callback is about to run. What do we want to have? What do we want to happen when we get back our error or result? If there isn't an error and there is result, we're just gonna res dot end the result. So we're going to respond with that result that we got back. Else, if there was an error, we're going to res dot end whatever that error was. So before we actually implement the call to the database, let's make sure that our database.create method is going to work and we'll get back a result and an error. So let's go up to database.create, and if you remember below, it's going to take a newbie and a callback. So newbie callback, and to mimic our asynchronous call, let's use set timeout. Set timeout. Our function, how long we'll wait, 3000 milliseconds. So let's call the callback. So if we're mimicking a successful call, then error is going to be null. And for the result, we'll just say success. So down in our post method, I did forget that we actually need to pass a newbie. So we'll just make a newbie real quick. Const newbie equals an empty object for now. So go ahead and open your integrated terminal. Make sure you stop any process that was already running with Control C, and then spin it back up with node index, listening on port 3000. Pull up Postman. Make sure you select post. Enter in local host 3000 / newbies and enter. And so when we hit enter, it should wait a minimum of 3 seconds and then give us our success response. So enter, and it responds with success. Alright, at this point you're going to need MongoDB and Mongodb Compass. If you don't already have those, then go ahead and make sure that you install those. If you're not sure how to install those on your computer, you can look in my videos, and there's 2 videos. One's going to be how to install MongoDB and get it set up, and there's also a MongoDB Compass video that will help you get that set up and started. And once you get those installed on your machine, then we can proceed with the next steps. Alright, at this point I'm going to assume that everybody's got MongoDB and MongoDB Compass installed and ready to go. The next thing that we're going to need to do is actually bring in the MongoDB Node.js driver into our project, and we're going to use npm to do that. Go ahead and open your integrated terminal. Let's go ahead and init our npm init, and you can just hit enter at this point and enter in all the information if you like, or if you just want to take all the defaults, just do --, yes, enter, and then you'll have your package.json file with no dependencies at this point. Then we need to bring in the MongoDB driver. We'll do that with npm install MongoDB, enter. And in that package.json file, you should see under dependencies MongoDB. Once we have that package installed, then we need to go ahead and require it. And we'll just go under our URL require and say const mongo client equals require MongoDB dot Mongo client. The Mongo client class that we're bringing in here is going to be how we create our client to connect to our database server. So down here, just before we hit server.listen, we want to go ahead and make our Mongo client.connect call, which is going to attempt to make a connection to the database. And if that's successful, it's going to console log that it was successful, and we'll know that we can now interact with our database. If not, it's going to return an error saying that we could not connect. We're going to do that with Mongo client.connect, and that's going to take a URL, which is going to be MongoDB / local host 27017, which, if you remember, when we spin up our MongoDB server locally, that's going to be the port that it's looking at. And then it's going to take a callback and give us an error. Client So we'll say if there is an error, we're just going to return console log could not connect to MongoDB server. We'll just put a new line in there and then display the error message. And this return is just there so that it doesn't, after it hits the if there is an error, then the return is just to stop the function call right here and not move on to any code below it. So if there is no error, we'll say console.log connected to database. And we're going to get client back from this function call. And then we want to call client.db and enter in the name of our database and store that in a variable. So we'll say db equals client.db, and we'll just call it node underscore newbies. And let's fix our parens here. You'll notice I didn't call const or let here for the declaration. We're going to do that outside of the function call because we're going to need a reference to it outside of the function call. So we'll just go back up to the top where we have our other definitions and say let db. Save. So once we call Mongo client.connect, it'll attempt to make that connection. If successful, it's going to give us back a client. We're going to call the client.db method and pass in what we want to name our database and then store that value in db. So once we have our db object, let's go back all the way to the top to our database.create method and get rid of this code in the middle. And now within the .create method, we can go ahead and put in our code for inserting one newbie into our database. And the way we do that is with db.collection. The name of our collection, we're going to call it newbies. Insert one, and you can see up here that it's going to take an object. That object is going to be the newbie that we're inserting into our database, and then it also takes a callback, which is going to give us back either our error or our result if successful. So we'll go ahead and take the newbie that was passed in right here, and we'll pass that into the insert one. And then in the callback, we're going to get back an error and a result. Now, if you remember, we're going to pass a callback in here, and then we're going to use that callback once we get either the error or the result. So down here in our post method, we're going to say database.create newbie, and then here's our callback. So we need to pass our callback two arguments, an error or null if there is no error, and then the result if it's there. If there is no result, then it doesn't matter, because in JavaScript, if you just leave out that parameter or that argument, you're not going to throw an error. So back up here, let's say if no error and there is a result, we're going to call back null and result. Else, so if there was an error, we're going to call back error. Alright, so now that we require actually getting a newbie passed to the .create method, which is being called by the _newbies.post method, we actually need to pass a newbie object in, because right now we're just passing in an empty object as newbie. So when we want to create a new newbie with the post method, we're going to have to send a body, and we're going to do that in JSON. So you go to body, raw, JSON, application JSON, and then here we're going to make an object. And for now, we're just going to do a name. We're not going to make this complicated whatsoever. It's just there's just going to be a name property, and we'll call him Brian for now. And so when we're making this post request, we're going to have post as our method, localhost 3000/newbies, and then for the body, we're going to send raw JSON with a simple object with one key value pair of name and Brian. So when we would send this, we would get routed all the way to this point where newbies.post, right? And our body would have gotten pushed onto the parsed request object that we had onto the .body property of the parsed rec object. And so what we want const newbie to equal is JSON dot parse parsed rec dot body. Now our newbie should equal that body that we sent with the post request, and then we're going to pass it into our create method, and our create method is going to pass it to our collection.insert1, and that should create our newbie, or not, and give us an error. So I just realized I made an error in our database.create method. When we're making our response with the result that's passed back to us, it comes back to us as an object, and we need to pass it back as a string. So we're going to have to say JSON.stringify result. So just make sure you update that piece of code. At this point, we should be able to go ahead and make a post request and add a newbie to our database. So first thing we need to do is make sure that our database is running. So go to View, Integrated Terminal, Mongodb. Remember, there's no B here, it's just Mongodb. Hit enter. And you should see waiting for connections on port 27017. Then you'll want to pull up leave this running, and then pull up another terminal, and then we're going to start up our node server. So node index, and you see listening on port 3000, and then we connected successfully, and it says connected to database. So we're going to want to go ahead and bring up MongoDB Compass. Go ahead and start that up, and it should come to this page. And leave all this to default. It should say localhost 27017. Hit connect. And it'll bring up all your databases on your computer for localhost 27017. I already tested this, so there's already a newbies database and collection here. Let me go ahead and drop those. So as you can see right now, there's the databases that we have here are admin, config, and local, and those are automatically added by MongoDB itself. When we make our first call to our database and add our first piece of data, our first document into a collection, then it should show up when we refresh. And so our databases show up here. When you go into one, that's going to be the collection, and in the collection you'll see your documents. So we'll look at that again after we add one. So we should be right here. We don't see our database because we haven't added any data to it. We can go ahead and minimize that. Bring up Postman. Select post. Type in local host 3000 newbies. Don't hit enter yet because we still have to give it a body. So click body, raw, JSON, an object. Like before, we'll say name and Brian, and hit send. And you'll see we got N1 OK1. Basically, this is just saying that we added one document to our database. So let's go ahead and look back at MongoDB Compass, and it's still not showing up. You have to hit the refresh up here, and you'll see it went from 3 to 4 databases. You'll see Node Newbies. Click on that, and it'll show our Newbies collection. Click on that, and then you'll see our document that was added, which this ID key value right here is added automatically by MongoDB. And then the one that we added ourselves, name Brian. Let's go back down and look at our post handler. And I want to just make a few adjustments to this. So instead of getting back this object right here, I actually want to get back the document that was added. And so how we're going to do that is this result should have a .ops array on it, and we want index 0 from that object, and that should give us back the document that we added. So let's try it again. So I'm just leaving this all the same. Well, let's change the name to Steve. Let's add one. Still didn't work because I didn't reset the server. Restart the server. Try it one more time. Let's do Tony. Send. And we get back name Tony and then the ID that MongoDB assigned to it. Alright, and that's our very first basic just post request, and the routing works good. We're adding to our database. Obviously this isn't the best code in the world. It's not checking for every error that could happen. This is just to get us going and seeing how we can add documents to our database. If you want to, you can go ahead and implement those other things yourself, but this video is already running pretty long, so I'm going to keep it short and sweet as possible. So moving along, now we can go ahead and work on our get. Okay, I want to take a different approach on get compared to how we just did post. With post, we started here and made our logic and then called database.create and then went ahead and made the create method. But this time I want to start from the database call here. So if we look at create, we needed a newbie to be passed in so that we could insert one newbie document into the database. We're not creating a document, we're trying to find a document with the read call. So we need to ask ourselves, how is the database going to know which document we want? And the way we're going to do that is with the object ID that is automatically put onto each document. So if I pulled back up Compass, remember this is the underscore ID key that was attached to our document automatically by Mongoose. And this is how we're going to find the document that we want, is by this ID right here. So the way that we're going to tell the database which document we want is we're going to grab the ID, copy it, and then in Postman we're going to make a GET request still to localhost 3000/newbies, but we're going to put the ID in a query string. And if you remember when I was talking about query strings, you do that with a question mark, and then you'll have the key, which will be ID equals, and then we'll paste in that ID. So if we were to make this GET request and hit send, we would get routed to the handlers newbies.get handler right here. And then if you remember down here, we've got that query string object that is attached to parsed rec object. And so we have that parsed rec object right here. And so we'll also have access to that query string. So when we make that database.read call, we'll be passing in that ID. So in our database.read call, we're going to take in ID and the callback. Now this ID that we're going to get is just going to be a string literal. What we need it to be is an object ID, because if we look back here at Compass again, you'll see that it's of type object ID. It's not just simply a string. And in order to do that, we're going to have to bring in the object ID off of the MongoDB driver that we brought in with npm. So we go back to the top. We can actually just take this, copy it, paste it. Let's change this to object ID. Copy, paste it right there. So now we're getting a variable object ID and we're requiring it from MongoDB.object ID. Then we need to go back down to our call and let's transform that ID to an object ID with const ID equals new object ID, and then we'll pass in, we're actually going to call that one newbie ID, and then change it up in our arguments. That way we're getting newbie ID and then passing newbie ID to the constructor of object ID, and then we'll have our ID object. Once we have that, we'll have all the information we need to go ahead and make the collection call, and this one's going to be called find one instead of insert one. So we'll say db.collection, and that collection is going to still be the newbies collection. Dot find one. Oop, one. And then we have a query object that we have here, and we're going to be querying by the ID. So if you remember down here in Compass, it was _ID, and the value is the ID. So we simply do _ID ID. So this ID is this ID, which is the object ID that we get from running that constructor. And then we need to pass in our callback. We're going to get back error, result, and then this is actually going to be exactly the same as up here, so we can copy that. Copy, paste. So if not error and there is a result, we're going to call back with null for the error and the return result. Else we'll call back the error that we get. All right, let's go to our get handler. Go ahead and get rid of that res.end. So we're still going to be passing in parsed rec and res. And let's go ahead and pull out that ID from the parsed rec. So const newbie ID equals parsed rec dot query string object dot ID. So ID is referring to that ID key in the query string object. Because remember, when we're getting the query string object, if there is no query string, we get just an empty object. And then what we're going to get should look something like _ID like that. So this ID right here is going to be, actually it's not going to have the underscore because we're just entering it as ID. So just ID colon our ID string. All right, so we have that stored in our variable. Let's go ahead and make our database call, database.read. And we're going to have to pass in that ID, newbie ID, and our callback, where we're going to get back the error or result. And again, this is going to be almost exactly the same as our create method, so we can copy that, paste that. Only difference is our result that we're going to get back is not going to be .ops, and this isn't what we're looking for. So let's just get rid of that, and we should be good with just result. And that result should be the queried document that we get back. All right, so let's go ahead and try our get. So let's go ahead and go to View, Integrated Terminal. Let's start up our database server, Mongodb, enter. We should get our waiting for connections on 27017. In a separate terminal, go ahead and say node index, enter. We'll get listening for port on port 3000 and connected to database. If you want to, I've gone ahead and dropped the newbies database that we already had on here. So we're starting from fresh in Compass, and then go to Postman. And let's go ahead and just create a newbie real quick. That way we know both are working. And we'll do that with local host 3000 / newbies. Go to body, raw, JSON, create an object, name Godzilla, and hit enter. And we get back name Godzilla with its ID. Let's go ahead and check that in Mongoose. Go ahead and hit in the upper left the refresh. Click on Node Newbies, and we see name Godzilla with the ID. So now let's check our get. Go ahead and copy the ID. Let's do a get. Do our query string. ID equals, paste in that ID. Hit send, and we get back Godzilla. So we know our get handler is working correctly. It's making the database call, and we're getting that back, that response back. And now we're ready to head to put so we can update documents. Alright, so when we want to update a document in our collection, we're going to use the put method. So when someone makes a request with put, they're going to send us a new updated object to replace that document with. So let's start up at our database call where we're calling database.update, and that's going to take 3 arguments. First one's going to be that newbie ID, because we need to know which document we're going to update, and we're going to query by the ID. And we need the new newbie that we're going to use to update the old one. And the callback. And most of the logic for our update method is going to be the same as the read right above us. So let's go ahead and copy that logic and paste it down in update. And let's go through it and change what we need. So this is fine. Const ID equals new object ID. So we're going to create a new object ID from that ID we pass in when the put method is handled. Then we're going to say db.collection, the newbies collection, and instead of find one, we're going to find one and update. And the first argument we're going to pass there is the ID, the query object right here, and pass in the ID. And then we also need to pass in the newbie object that we're going to use to update the document. And then this next argument is going to be optional. If I were just to leave it as its default, we would get back the old document that we updated. But I want to get back the new document after it's been updated. And the way we do that is in options object. And the option we're going to change is return original. Return original. And we're going to say false, comma. And then the last one is going to be our callback. This if statement is going to be the same. So if not an error and we get the result, then we're going to call back that result. Else we're going to call back that error. So let's move down and update the put method. Get rid of that. So a lot of this logic is going to be the same as our post. So let's go ahead and copy that. Copy and paste. And we're also going to need the newbie ID. So let's go up to the get and let's copy the newbie ID. Paste that in. So now we'll have access to the body that's being sent, and we're going to put that in the newbie variable, and that's going to be our updated data that we're going to pass to the update method. And then in order to query for that document, we'll need the newbie ID. We're going to store that in newbie ID. Down here, instead of database.create, it's going to be update. And then our arguments, the first one's going to be newbie ID. Second one's going to be the newbie object. And then our callback. So instead of responding with result.ops, we're going to be responding with result.value. Alright, so just to go over it one more time, someone makes a put request, they're going to go ahead and put in the query string the ID of the document that they're wanting to update, and then they're going to pass into the body what we're going to replace that document with. And we capture those two in these two variables. We're going to pass them to our update method. Up in our update method, we convert that ID to an object ID, make a call to our collection with find one and update, pass in our ID, our newbie. Optionally, we want the new document that's going to get returned, and then we call our callback. Let's go ahead and test this out. Go to View, Integrated Terminal, Mongodb. Make sure we get connections on port 27017. Open a different terminal, Node index. Make sure we're getting listening on port 3000 and connected to database. Let's do a post call to create a document to update, and that's going to be local host 3000 / newbies. Go to the body, select raw, JSON, object with a key of name and a value of Steve. Hit send, and we get back Steve. Let's go ahead and test that that's actually in our database with Compass. Connect. Node newbies, and looks like I had the old Steve in there. So let's just delete that Steve. We'll delete that Steve. Let's send one more Steve. Brand new Steve. Update our database. There it is. Okay, so we got our brand new Steve. So let's go ahead and try to put. We're going to need a query string with an ID equals. Take this ID down here, paste it up here, and then let's change Steve to Todd. Hit send, and we get back to Tude. Should have been Todd, but now it's Tude. Perfect. Well, we want it to be Todd, so let's go ahead and update it. And we get Todd. So I made multiple requests there to put, so let's make sure we don't have multiple documents, right? We should just have Todd, and we do. Alright, our put request is now being handled correctly. Let's go ahead and move on to delete. All right, so when we get a delete request, that means that someone wants to delete one of the documents, and this is going to look a lot like a GET request, only instead of just responding with the document, we're going to respond with the document but also delete it from the database, and we just return the document so that they know which one has been deleted. So let's go to database.delete, and it's going to take in newbie ID and a callback. The logic is going to look a lot like our read. So let's go up to database.read. Go ahead and copy that, paste it in delete. So we're taking our newbie ID and creating an object ID, calling database.collection newbies.find one and delete, passing in that query object with the ID and defining our callback. If there's not an error in the result, we're going to return the result, else we're going to return the error. So let's go down to our delete method handler. Let's grab the logic from newbies.get, copy, paste. We're grabbing that ID that we're going to be sent in the query string. We're going to pass that to database.delete. Give it that error and the callback, and then the result is going to be result.value. Save that. All right, so let's see if we can delete a document. Go ahead and pull up your terminal. Start your database, Mongodb. Open up a new terminal, node index. Make sure you're connected. Go to Postman. Let's make another document to delete. Local host 3000/newbies. Go to body, raw, JSON, object, name, Brian. Hit send. We get back Brian. Let's copy that ID. Go to delete. So it'll be localhost 3000 newbies $ID equals, paste that ID in, and then before we hit this, let's just double check, make sure that Brian's in the database. Hit refresh. There's Brian. All right, let's hit delete or send, and we get the ID and Brian back, and it should be gone from the database. Update, and it's gone. All right, so now we're able to create, read, update, and delete documents from our MongoDB database. We can just briefly recap on all the code that we have here. So basically we start off where we're going to create our server. So we create our server. It gets in that request handler with our request and response objects. We're going to parse the request data and put it in our parsed request object. Any body that we get, we're going to go ahead and also stick that onto the parsed request object. Then based on the URL, we're going to route the request to either newbies or not found, and then call that handler, and we're going to pass it, and we're going to pass it the parsed rec object, the response object. So if we get a get request, it'll call this handler. If it's post, this handler, put, and delete. And depending on which handler is called, it's going to call that database method, either create, read, update, or delete. Obviously, there's going to be holes in the error handling. I'm not trying to catch everything. This is basically just to get a simple API application going so that we can see how we can use Node to interact with a MongoDB database. Feel free to maybe try to catch some of those mistakes that I made, or maybe things that I left out. And that brings us to the end of the project. I hope most of what I said was clear. Like I said, I didn't go over every little detail. There's things that I left out. Some of the things that I left out just because I didn't want there to be a whole lot of noise in the code and trying to keep it very minimal. Like when we're responding, we're not sending back a response header of the status code, which is super easy. But like I said, I just wanted to keep it real minimal right now. And so now that we've gone through beginning to end creating the API for a CRUD application, now we can go back and visit every small little detail and go over those. And now you have at least some context of why it's important what you're learning at that point. So I'll see you in those future videos.